Hello again, friend. I'm recording this on the same night as I did chapters 2 and 3. I took a bath and found myself just antsy, you know? So, I've, in an effort to not stir my energy any further, got myself a cup of water this time, as frankly the coffee didn't do much for my energy anyhow. And so, my friend, I propose we journey forth through chapters 4 and 5, maybe even 6, depending on how I feel when we get there. What say you? Well, I suppose you can't give direct input. So, if you decide to stick with me on this journey, then I present to you Chapter 4 of the War of the Worlds. The cylinder opens. When I returned to the common, the sun was setting. Scattered groups were hurrying from the direction of Woking. 1 or 2 persons were returning. The crowd about the pit had increased and stood out black against the lemon yellow of the sky. A couple 100 people, perhaps. There were raised voices, and some of struggle appeared to be going about the pit. Strange imaginings passed through my mind. As I drew nearer, I heard Stent's voice. Keep back, keep back. The boy came running towards me. It's a movin', he said as he passed. A screwin' in, a screwin' out. I don't like it, I'm a goin' home, I am. I went on to the crowd. There were really, I should think, 200 or 300 people elbowing and jostling one another, the 1 or 2 ladies there being by no means the least active. He's fallen in the pit, cried someone. Keep back, said several. The crowd swayed a little, and I elbowed my way through. Everyone seemed greatly excited. Heard a peculiar humming sound from the pit. I say, said Ogilvy, keep these idiots back. We don't know what's in the confounded thing, you know. I saw a young man, a shop assistant in Woking, I believe he was, standing in the cylinder and trying to scramble out of the hole again. The crowd had pushed him in. The end of the cylinder was being screwed out from within. Nearly 2 feet of shining screw projected. Somebody blundered against me, and I narrowly missed being pitched onto the top of the screw. I turned, and as I did so the screw must have come out, for the lid of the cylinder fell upon the gravel with a ringing concussion. I stuck my elbow into the person behind me and turned my head towards the thing again. For a moment, the circular cavity seemed perfectly black. I had the sunset in my eyes. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike us terrestrial men, but in all essentials a man. I know I did. But looking, I presently saw something stirring within the shadow. Grayish, billowy movements, one after another, and 2 luminous discs, like eyes. Then something resembling a little gray snake about the thickness of a walking stick curled up out of the writhing middle and wriggled in the air towards me. Then another. A sudden chill came over me. There was a loud shriek from the one behind. I half turned, keeping my eyes fixated upon the cylinder still, from which other tentacles were now projecting, and began pushing my way back from the edge of the pit. I saw astonishment giving place to horror on the faces of the people about me. Heard inarticulate exclamations on all sides. There was a general movement backwards. I saw the shopman struggling still on the edge of the pit. I found myself alone, and saw the people on the other side of the pit running off, Stent among them. I looked again at the cylinder, and ungovernable terror gripped me. I stood petrified and staring. As I take these increments of time between paragraphs to hydrate, I would like to remind you to also drink water. It is very important, especially if you are up in the northern hemisphere during these hot summer days, to keep your whistle wet. big, grayish-rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. The two large, dark-colored eyes were regarding me steadfastly. The mask that framed them, the head of the thing, was rounded and had, one might say, a face. There was a mouth under the eyes, the lipless brim of which quivered and panted and dropped saliva. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A lank tentacular appendage gripped the edge of the cylinder. Another swayed in the air. Those who have never seen a living Martian can scarcely imagine the strange horror of its appearance. The peculiar V-shaped mouth with its pointed upper lip, the absence of brow ridges, the absence of a chin beneath the wedge-like lower lip, the incessant quivering of its mouth, the Gorgon group of tentacles, the tumultuous breathing of the lungs in a strange atmosphere, the evident heaviness and painfulness of movement due to the greater gravitational energy of the Earth. Above all, the extraordinary intensity of immense eyes were at once vital and intense, inhuman, crippled, and monstrous. Monstrous, my apologies. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the tedious movements unspeakably nasty. Even at this first encounter, this first glimpse, I was overcome with disgust and dread. Suddenly, the monster vanished. It had toppled over the brim of the cylinder and fallen into the pit with a thud like the fall of a great mass of leather. I heard it give a peculiar thick cry, and forthwith another one of these creatures appeared darkly in the deep shadow of the aperture. I turned and, running madly, made for the first group of trees, perhaps 100 yards away. But I ran slantingly and stumbling, for I could not avert my face from these things. There, among some young pine trees and furze bushes, I stopped, panting and waiting further developments. The common around the sandpits was dotted with people standing like myself in a half-fascinated terror, staring at these creatures, or rather at the heaped gravel at the edge of the pit in which they lay. And then, with renewed horror, I saw a round black object bobbing up and down on the edge of the pit. It was the head of the shopman who had fallen in, but showing as a little black object against the hot western sun. Now he got his shoulder and knee up, again seemed to slip back until only his head was visible. Suddenly he vanished, and I could have fancied a faint shriek had reached me. A momentary impulse to go back to help him, but my fears overruled. Everything, then, was quite invisible, hidden by the deep pit and the heap of sand that the fall of the cylinder had made. Anyone coming along the road from Cobham or Woking would have been amazed at the sight, a dwindling multitude of perhaps 100 people or more standing in a great irregular circle, in ditches, behind bushes, behind gates and hedges, saying little to one another, but in short, excited shouts and staring hard at a few heaps of sand. The barrow of Ginger Beer stood, a queer derelict, black against the burning sky, and in the sand pits was a row of deserted vehicles with their horses feeding out of nose bags or pawing the ground. I think I'm going to call it after this next chapter, as my energy seems to be a little dwindling. Although our time right now may be short, I have enjoyed it still. Chapter 5, The Heat Ray. After the glimpse I had had of the Martians emerging from the cylinder in which they had come to the Earth from their planet, a kind of fascination paralyzed my actions. I remained standing knee-deep in the heather, staring at the mound that hid them. I was a battleground of fear and curiosity. I did not dare go back towards the pit, but I felt a passionate longing to peer into it. I began walking, therefore, in a big curve, seeking some point of vantage and continually looking at the sand heaps that hid these newcomers to our Earth. Once Alicia's thin black whips, like the arms of an octopus, flashed across the sunset and was immediately withdrawn. And afterwards a thin rod stood up, joint by joint, bearing at its apex a circular disc that spun with a wobbling motion. What could be going on there? Most of the spectators had gathered in one or two groups, one a little crowd towards Woking, the other a knot of people in the direction of Cobham. Evidently they shared my mental conflict. There were a few near me. One man I approached, he was, I perceived, a neighbor of mine, though I did not know his name, was it, and accosted, but it was scarcely a time for articulate conversation. "What ugly brutes," he said. "Good God, what ugly brutes." He repeated this over and over again. "Did you see a man in the pit?" I said, but he made no answer to that. We became silent and stood watching for a time side by side, deriving, I fancy, a certain comfort in one another's company. Then I shifted my position to a little knoll that gave me the advantage of a yard or more of elevation, and when I looked for him presently he was walking towards Woking. The sunset faded to twilight before anything further happened. The crowd far away on the left towards Woking seemed to grow. I now heard a faint murmur from it. The little knot of people towards Cobham dispersed. There was scarcely an intimation of movement from the pit. Do I not have my blinking states? Oh, okay. Sorry. Just a little flattered by my own low PNG presence. Sorry, I paid $60 for the full PNG. I'm very satisfied with it. Focus. Look, all I'm going to say is I'm cute. That's it. Anyways, apologies for the tangent, friend. Though I must say reading to you is such a delight, even though you may not be able to speak directly with me at this moment, I feel I built a small bit of intimacy to the point that I can at least go on these little tangents with you. Apologies if you don't feel the same. Regardless, it was this, as much as anything, that gave people courage, and I suppose the new arrivals from Woking had also helped to restore confidence. At any rate, as the dusk came on, a slow intermittent movement upon the sand pits began, a movement that seemed to gather force as the stillness of the evening about the cylinder remained unbroken. Vertical black figures in twos and threes would advance, stop, watch, and advance again, spreading out as they did so in a thin, irregular crescent that promised to enclose the pit in its attenuated horns. I too on my side began to move towards the pit, and then saw some cabmen and others had walked boldly into the sand pits, heard the clatter of hoofs and the gride of wheels. I saw a lad trundling off the barrel of apples, and then within 30 yards of the pit, advancing from the direction of Horsell, I noted a small black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. This was a deputation. There had been a hasty consultation, since Martians were evidently, in spite of their repulsive forms, intelligent creatures. It had been resolved to show them, by approaching them with signals, that we too were intelligent. Flutter, flutter went the flag. First to the right, then to the left. It was too far for me to recognize anyone there, but afterwards I learned that Ogilvy, Stent, and Henderson were the ones were with others in attempt at communication. This little group had in advance dragged inward, so to speak, the circumference, the now almost complete circle of people, and a number of dim black figures followed at discreet distances. Suddenly there was a flash of light, and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in 3 distinct puffs, which drove up one after another straight into the still air. This smoke, or flame perhaps would be the better word for it, was so bright that the deep blue sky overhead and the hazy stretches of brown common toward Chertsey, set with black pine trees, seemed to darken abruptly as these puffs rose, and to remain the darker after their dispersal. At the time, a faint hissing sound became audible. Beyond the pit stood a little wedge of people with the white flag at its apex, arrested by these phenomena, a little knot of small vertical black shapes upon the black ground. As the green smoke arose, their faces flashed up pallid green and faded again as it vanished. Then slowly the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Slowly a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it. Forthwith, flashes of actual flame, a bright glare leaping from one another, sprang up from the scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet pinged upon them and flashed into a white flame. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned into fire. Then, by the light of their own destruction, I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run. I stood staring, not yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in the little distant crowd. All I felt was that it was something very strange, an almost noiseless and blinding flash of light, and a man fell to headlong and lay still. As the unseen shaft of heat passed over them, pine trees burst into fire, and every dry frizzy bush became with one dull thud a mass of flames. And far away towards Knapp Hill, I saw the flashes of trees and hedges and wooden buildings suddenly set alight. It was sweeping round swiftly and steadily, this flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat. I perceived it coming towards me by the flesh and bushes it touched. I was too astounded or stupefied to stir. I heard the crackle of fire and the sand pits and the sudden squeal of a horse that was as suddenly stilled. It was as if an invisible yet intensely heated finger were drawn through the heather between me and the Martians. And all along a curving line beyond the sand pits and the dark ground smoked and crackled. Something fell with a crash far away to the left where the road from Woking Station opens out on the common. Forthwith the hissing and humming ceased. The black dome-like object sank slowly out of sight into the pit. All this had happened with such swiftness that I had stood motionless, dumbfounded and dazzled by the flashes of light. And that death swept through a full circle, it inevitably must have slain me in my surprise. But it passed and spared me, and left the night about me suddenly dark and unfamiliar. The undulating common seemed now dark, almost to blackness, except where its roadways lay gray and pale under the deep blue sky of the early night. It was dark and suddenly void of men. Overhead the stars were mustering, and in the west the sky was still a pale, bright, almost greenish blue. The tops of the pine trees and roofs of Horsell came out sharp and black against the western afterglow. The Martians and their appliances were altogether invisible, save for that thin mast upon which their restless mirror wobbled. Patches of bush and isolated trees here and there smoked and glowed still, and the houses towards Woking Station were sent up spires of flame into the stillness of the evening air. Nothing was changed save for that and a terrible astonishment. A little group of black specks with the white flag had been swept out of existence. The stillness of the evening, so it seemed to me, had scarcely been broken. It came to me that I was upon this dark common, helpless, unprotected, and alone. Suddenly, like a thing falling upon me from without, came fear. With an effort I turned and began a stumbling run through the heather. The fear I felt was no rational fear, but a panic terror not only of the Martians, but of the dusk and stillness all about me. Such extraordinary effect in unmanning me. It had that I ran, weeping silently as a child might do. Once I had turned, I did not dare look back. I remember I felt an extraordinary persuasion that I was being played with, that presently, while I was on the very edge of safety, this mysterious death, as swift as the passage of light, would leap after me from the pit about the cylinder and strike me down. You know what, friends? You know what? Chapter 6 is only 2 pages. I shall spoil you with 2 more pages. Chapter 6, The Heat Ray in the Cobham Road. Or is it Chobham? I don't speak British. It is still a matter of wonder how the Martians are able to slay men so swiftly and so silently. Many think that in some way they're able to generate an intense heat in a chamber of practically absolute non-conductivity. This intense heat they project in a parallel beam against any object they choose, by means of a polished parabolic mirror of unknown composition, much as a parabolic mirror of a lighthouse projects a beam of light. But no one has absolutely proved these details. However it is done, it is certain that a beam of heat is the essence of the matter. Heat and invisible instead of visible light. Whatever is combustible flashes into flame at its touch. Lead runs like water, it softens iron, cracks and melts glass, and when it falls upon water, continentally, that explodes into steam. That night, nearly 40 people lay under the starlight about the pit, charred and distorted beyond recognition. And all night long the common from Horsell to Maybury was deserted and brightly ablaze. The news of the massacre probably reached Cobham, Woking, and Ottershaw about the same time. In Woking, the shops had closed when the tragedy happened, and a number of people, shop people and so forth, attracted by the stories they had heard, were walking over the Horsell Bridge and along the road between the hedges that runs out at last upon the common. You may imagine that the young people brushed up after the labours of the day in making this novelty, as they would make any novelty, the excuse for walking together and enjoying of trivial flirtation. You may figure to yourself the hum of voices along the road and the gloaming. As yet, of course, few people in Woking even knew that the cylinder had opened, though poor Henderson had sent a messenger on a bicycle to the post office with a special wire to an evening paper. As these folks came out by 2s and 3s upon the open, they found little knots of people talking excitedly and peering at the spinning mirror over the sandpits, and the newcomers were, no doubt, soon infected by the excitement and the occasion. By 8:30, when the deputation was destroyed, there may have been a crowd of 300 people or more at this place, besides those who had left the road to approach the marchants nearer. There were 3 policemen, too, one of whom was mounted, doing their best under the instructions from Stent to keep the people back and deter them from approaching the cylinder. There was some booing from those more thoughtless and excitable souls, to whom a crowd is always an occasion for noise and horseplay. Stent and Ogilvy, anticipating some possibilities of collision, had telegraphed from Horsell to the barracks as soon as the Martians emerged, for the help of a company of soldiers to protect these strange creatures from violence. After that, they returned to lead that ill-fated advance. The description of their death, as it was seen by the crowd, tallies very closely with my own impressions. The 3 puffs of green smoke, the deep humming tone or note, and the flashes of flame. But the crowd of people had a far narrower escape than mine. Only the fact that a hummock of heathery sand intercepted the lower part of the heat ray saved them. The elevation of the parabolic mirror been a few yards higher. None could have lived to tell the tale. I saw the flashes and the men falling, and an invisible hand, as it were, lit the bushes as it hurried towards them through the twilight. Then, with a whistling note that rose above the droning of the pit, the beam swung close over their heads, lighting the tops of the beech trees that lined the road and splitting the bricks, smashing the windows, firing the window frames, and breaking down and crumbling for one a portion of the gable of the house nearest the corner. and a sudden thud, hiss, and a glare of the igniting trees. The panic-stricken crowd seems to have swayed hesitantly for some moments. Sparks and burning twigs began to fall to the road in single leaves like puff of flame. Hats and dresses caught fire. Then came a crying from the common. There were shrieks and shouts, and suddenly a mounted policeman came galloping through the confusion with his hands clasped over his head, screaming, "They're coming!" A woman shrieked, and incontinently everyone was turning and pushing at those behind in order to clear the way to Woking again. Mr. bolted as blindly as a flock of sheep. Where the road grows narrow and black between the high banks, the crowd jammed, and a desperate struggle occurred. All that crowd did not escape. 3 persons at least, 2 women and a little boy, were crushed and trampled there, and left to die amid the terror and the darkness. Well, my friend, that's where we'll leave it off for tonight. I do hope you've enjoyed yourself at least half as much as I have. It's always a pleasure. Until next time, au revoir.